Hi there, I'm Gavin Crawford. I'm a writer, an actor, and a comedian. And for the last 8 or 9 years, I have been navigating life with my mother's increasing dementia. Has it been sad? Yeah. Has it been funny? Also, yeah. That's what my brand new podcast series, Let's Not Be Kidding, is about. It's the true story of my life as a comedian, my mom, and dementia. Let's Not Be Kidding. With me, Gavin Crawford. A new 7-part series from CBC Podcasts, available now.
You're listening to a Frequency Podcast Network production.
The next time you walk around your neighborhood, or if you work in a city, the area around your office, I'd like you to try something. As you walk down streets, past storefronts, try to picture what was there in 2019, before the pandemic and everything that's happened since. If you have that in your mind, compare it to what you see now. Which businesses have vanished? Which new ones, if any, have opened? Are there empty locations where stores or restaurants have closed but nothing has yet replaced them? Are there, by any chance, a lot of those? All the numbers that we have would point to yes, and that's true almost no matter where you live. Canadian small business insolvencies spiked last year to a level not seen in more than a decade. And insolvencies alone don't tell the whole story, because a lot of business owners don't declare bankruptcy, they just close up shop and walk away. Now, it might be worth hoping that the worst is behind us. The lockdowns of the pandemic are almost 2 years in the past. Perhaps this year we'll see a correction. More business, more profits, more openings and fewer closings. Look, it's nice to have hope. The problem is, a few weeks ago was the federal government's deadline for small businesses to pay back their pandemic loans. And a whole lot of them couldn't afford it. So, here we go again. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Ryan Mallough is the Ontario Vice President with the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. That can't be too comfortable a job these days, Ryan.
I will say there's never a shortage of things to do, and it is never dull.
Okay, well, let's go back a few years, like I'm sure many businesses wish they could, and rewind to pre-pandemic, or maybe just the beginning of the pandemic, once we realized this was going to be incredibly serious and everything would shut down. How quickly at that point did help for businesses become available? And for those who are not familiar with it, just briefly, like, what kind of help was it?
So it was relatively fast. And I say that because for government, this was moving at light speed. It was not immediate, but they did move fairly quickly as far as governments are concerned. And the first piece that I believe we saw come in was the wage subsidy help. And one of the main drivers on that, aside from organizations like us at CFIB, was we started to see other countries do that very quickly. Denmark got on it fast. Sweden got on it fast. The UK, Australia, Ireland. And so we noticed an immediate need for that. So the original program was a 10% wage subsidy coming from government, which was immediately businesses were saying not remotely enough, not going to be helpful. And we saw that climb quickly to a 75% subsidy. That was the first piece that came in within a couple of weeks of the first lockdowns.
And as it became clear that these lockdowns were going to drag on and that people were not coming back on foot traffic to retail stores or other businesses quickly, what else was made available? I'm asking this now to set the table because we're going to talk about them all vanishing.
Absolutely. So we saw 3 main programs join the wage subsidy. The first that a lot of individuals will be familiar with is CERB, and that was the individual benefit to help with people who weren't working, who were between jobs, or who were not affected by the wage subsidy portion. The second one, which came in a little bit later and not as quickly as I think as we would have liked, was the original program, I believe, was called CCRA. It was the rental assistance program for small businesses. Again, you've been locked down by government, your rent is still due. There was some help that was provided from that. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the third one, which is the one that we've been focused on throughout the last couple of years, was the CEBA loan. And that was at the time, an up to $40,000 loan to help businesses sort of bridge the gap from being shut down to reopening. And the deal there was that you would get $10,000 of that forgiven as long as you paid 30 out of the 40 by the deadline. Late in 2020, I believe, there was an extension to that, or in addition to that, which had added another $20,000, another 10 forgivable, totaling up to a $60,000 loan, $20,000 forgivable if you paid it by the deadline.
How well did it work? And by that, I mean, can we tell now with hindsight what would have happened without it, what we'd be looking at if this money hadn't been made available?
I think it's not a stretch to say that these programs were absolutely essential at the time. I think too, and it's tough to remember all the way back into 2020 because the years seem to all mesh together. But when those first lockdowns were announced, and I'm from Toronto, and so my remembrance was we killed St. Patrick's Day, right? We wanted to make sure the restaurants and clubs were closed for that. When that first happened, everyone was talking about a couple of weeks, right? We just need 2 to 3 weeks to close. Then, we'll be able to sort of stop this thing in its tracks and then we'll get back to normal. Yeah. Well, it was 3 years and you yo-yoed in between lockdowns. If you were, a Toronto restaurant, you lost over 400 days to full closure, let alone the capacity limitations, the various zones that we went through, the reopening stages. So having these government programs to help provide some financial flexibility to help bridge some of the gaps, to keep employees connected to their employers so we weren't going through a mass rehiring once we finally reopened, were absolutely essential at the time to small businesses' survival. And I think if we didn't have them, it would be fair to say that we would be seeing a little bit what we're seeing now on the closure side a lot earlier and a lot faster.
How long did those programs stay in effect? And give us a sense of where they are now and how it compares to, as you mentioned, the ebb and flow of pandemic closures. We are now fully reopened. We are still technically in a pandemic, but how long did the government aid continue as the pandemic did?
So the programs generally lasted through 2022. Was the bulk of them, which again, when we look at the closure timeline, the last time that we were fully locked down, I believe was January 2022. And I think we were the last province. So they lasted for, the full 2 years, which was important. And then when it comes to the CEBA loan, the repayment deadline was ultimately extended to January 18th of this year, 2024. So they were around for a fairly long time. I think one of the challenges a lot of small business owners feel, though, is that when we started to reopen in 2022, I think a lot of us, myself included, really believed that, this was it, that we were, there were going to be some differences, but we were going to be back. And what we reopened to is certainly not what we closed to. And that reality is why we've been fighting, why so many small business owners have been saying we need these programs to continue to exist or to get those deadlines extended because things are very different.
Describe that for me. How different was it? What was the difference between what you closed to and what you reopened to? Like, put me on the ground.
I think in some cases it may depend on where you are, but if you're in a major city, Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, you are a dry cleaner, a restaurant that's downtown, you closed down to people coming into work 5 days a week. There was a natural lunch rush. There was sort of a cadence to everybody's week that was relatively similar, at least on the office worker side. What you reopened to was initially not just the hybrid work that we're starting to see kind of firm up now in the 2 to 3 days a week for a lot of office workers, but really still a lot of remote work where people weren't coming in at all. There was no lunch rush, or the rush that, was a few thousand people back in 2019 was now maybe 100. That's a huge, huge difference when you had built your business around the cadence of the work week and now the work week's not there. The other side of that was we opened to start seeing a cost of living crisis really take hold. We saw inflation skyrocket, which had impact on all of us as consumers, but a huge impact on businesses as well, which started to affect spending. So restaurants that were really relying on people being excited to get back out, to, get onto patios again, to go out to eat again, were finding that people didn't have the same kind of disposable income, that instead of going out maybe 2-3 times a week, it was once a week or once every couple of weeks. That had a major impact too. So there was a whole psychological change, let alone financial reality change that was really there when we reopened as well.
Let's talk about the financial reality then. These programs went up to, most of them, the end of 2022. What was 2023 like? What was last year like for small businesses in Canada?
So I think there was some optimism heading into the year that, this is the first year where we are really, from a business sense, free of the pandemic, right? We're not entering the year into lockdowns. There isn't really a threat of lockdowns happening. This is going to be sort of the bounce back year. And what we saw was, we measure small business optimism at CFIB, and we saw optimism kind of crater within the first couple of months of the year because we started to see interest rates starting to creep up. And that was having a major impact, again, both on consumer spending and on business operations. We started to see, not just the realities of it, but also the psychological hold that, the threat of recession was very real. And that's having an impact on people as well. And just not seeing consumer habits return, not seeing consumers themselves return. And suddenly it was a very worry, I think, is sort of what took hold in the small business community that, not only are we not going back to where we were, but that this new reality that we're in is sluggish and is going to stay that way. And that's going to force a lot of difficult decisions for business owners.
Can we quantify this new reality? Like, what kind of sense do we have of how much consumer behavior has changed, what revenues are like for businesses? I understand it vary industry to industry, but like when you look at an area of businesses as a whole, what's missing?
As much as we can, we're surveying our members, trying to get a feel for their day-to-day, month-to-month on the ground. And we know that about only half of businesses are sort of back to what they would consider normal revenues, sort of pre-pandemic revenues. We know that, from a foot traffic sense and those like the office towers have fallen into their cadence in downtown cores where the 5 days a week just isn't coming back, and that's sort of plateaued. We know that even with the benefit of having some time, small business pandemic related debt is still sitting around $100,000, which is more than the entirety of that $60,000 CEBA loan. So we know that there was additional debt that was taken on. And now we are starting to see, insolvency and bankruptcy numbers come out, which are worrying, but also importantly, only tell a small fraction of the story, because we know from surveying our members that only about 10% would go that bankruptcy route if they're going to wind down their business. A lot of them, about 43%, just close it down, sort of go quietly into the night. So I think we're starting to see the ramifications of the businesses that, thought they could make a go or have tried to make a go and decided they couldn't. But I think we're still very much at the beginning of that story, not the end.
Even though it's a small part of the picture, explain the insolvencies and the bankruptcies to me. Like, what is it in raw numbers? How does it compare to other bad years, I guess?
So we've seen, I believe it's year over year, but about a 41% increase in business insolvencies. I think that represents around 4,500 businesses. But again, we know that that's not the main route, especially small businesses take. On the flip side of that, which is getting a little bit less of attention, we're also seeing fewer startups than we have traditionally as well. And that's also a little bit concerning. It's a sign of the times. I mean, starting a business is a risk. It's a financial risk. When interest rates are high, there's less appetite to do it. But I think, a lot of times when we see businesses close, one of the things we hear is like, well, there's a natural churn that happens. Businesses open, businesses close. It's a circle of life. That is absolutely true. That is something that happens. But I think what we're seeing with this uptick in insolvencies and sort of the feeling that a lot of us have as we walk around downtowns, be they large cities or more rural or smaller areas, where we're seeing businesses close, is that this is not just business decision. This is not the case of, it's 2024 and someone opened a pager shop. Bad business decisions happen, but that's not what this is. This is the consequences of 2+ years of yo-yoing into lockdown, of being completely shut off from customers, of allowing big businesses to be open a lot of that time. And so we sort of forced a shift in consumer habits, really coming home to roost.
How can you determine how much of these closures are driven by the aftermath of the pandemic, the end of the support programs, and et cetera, and how much are driven by the natural ebbs and flows? Because I know we're in an ebb now. You've mentioned the interest rates, which obviously impact both consumers and businesses. People are not spending as much money. Those things happen, and they have happened in the past. And I would assume you would see insolvencies and closures tick up as well. And, there's a difference, I guess, between the unfortunate timing of this affordability crisis and the lack of support coming out of the pandemic.
Yeah, it's hard to really parse it out and to say exactly, which one was which. It could be, did a business take on a lot of debt during the pandemic? Yes, but had we not been in the under the inflationary pressures and the interest rate pressures that we've been under, would they have been able to make a go of it after? Possibly. It's unfortunately not the reality that we're at, so it's hard to tell. But we know that heading into that January 18th CEBA deadline, our numbers showed that about 20 to 25% of businesses were not going to be able to pay it off. And when we hit that deadline, the government's own numbers back that up. So I think it is very fair to say that the uptick that we're seeing is a result of some of the programs ending, the pandemic pressure sort of finally becoming too much. How much of it compared to the other ebbs and flows, how much of it is because we are very much in an ebb right now, that's tough for us to parse out. It's tough for StatsCan to parse out too. But I think it's all very much factoring in.
So obviously 2024 starting with the repayment deadline for these loans is does not augur well for the year to come, I guess. You mentioned this deadline is something the government had already extended previously. Had they been asked to extend it again and determined that they would not, what have they said about making this the deadline and why?
Yeah, so we were at the forefront of asking for a deadline extension. We wanted to see to the end of 2024, give business owners another year to be able to get at, importantly, that forgivable portion, right? There is a pretty sizable difference from paying off $40,000 of a loan and not having to pay the remaining 20 because it was forgiven versus taking on the full 60, which is what happens if you miss the deadline and had the loan. So we were very, very much pushing for that. We actually saw a tremendous amount of support in the business community, the Restaurants Association, Tourism Association, the Chambers of Commerce. We even saw all 13 provincial and territorial premiers get on board with that ask and make it federally. The Bloc Québécois was there federally. The NDP, the Green Party was there federally. But ultimately, the government was only willing to move an additional 18 days off of the original December 31, 2023.
Did they give a reason for that?
Really, what we seemed to hear back there was, it's been enough time. They felt that they'd been flexible enough that they're really wanting to move on from this. And look, I, as much as anybody out there, would love to stop talking about the pandemic. I would love to put it in the background. But the reality is, for a lot of small businesses, that impact is still very much there. So many of them lost so much time. I mean, we talk a lot about, restaurants get a lot of attention. Retail gets a lot of attention. Gyms were closed for the same amount of time. If you were an event space, you were not at full capacity for, it was almost 3 years. It was wild what that impact is, and just reopening is not a silver bullet. And unfortunately, a lot of these businesses can't put it behind them because they're still dealing with that impact day to day.
What do you know then about what 2024 will be like, assuming this deadline has already passed, it's not going to be extended, and the government does do away with the forgivable portion of those loans? Have you guys been able to, probably not put a number on it, but what's the talk around the association?
So I think there's a lot of concern. I think when you look at a lot of small business owners, you can't get into being an entrepreneur if you're not optimistic. You have to believe what you are doing is going to work. That's a natural state of being for them.
Sure.
We track small business optimism. And again, it has been low. It is starting the year still very low, well below where it historically is across the country. And I think that really is a reflection of the concern of, am I going to be able to make it? You've got, yes, the pressures of pandemic debt for realistically probably about 250,000 businesses who are still going to be carrying that over the next few years, just on the CEBA loan side. But you've also got, we saw changes to CPP where that went up in some instances. EI went up in some instances. You pay payroll taxes on employees no matter what. Your revenue, your profit doesn't matter. The carbon tax is going up again. It would have been tough coming off of the pandemic anyway. But the reality that we have now, the global pressures that we're seeing as well, just not a lot of optimism heading into 2024.
I want to ask you a broader question about what you see on the ground, what people who are listening to this might be experiencing in their neighborhoods. When you take all of this together, everything from the start of COVID to the lockdowns and unlockings and the interest rates and the affordability crisis and everything, what do small businesses in Canadian neighborhoods look like now compared to pre-pandemic? And, what have we lost and what happens to neighborhoods that have lost them?
So I think in terms of what it looks like now, I mean, again, we've all experienced it. You're noticing a few more boarded up shops. You're noticing that those are not getting replaced as quickly as perhaps they used to. But I think you see it too when you're, out and about when the weather is good, when you're out and about in the community where there's not as many people necessarily as there was. The buzz isn't quite there. And again, it's a reflection of the cost of living pinch that we're all going through. But it is having an impact. And I think a lot of the times, governments, people, we tend to focus on sort of the numerical impact, right? And that is not good. But I think what we have lost a little bit in, being cooped up inside and very rightfully, worried about what's happening in our own lives over the last few years is that what small businesses mean to a community is often, it's not overlooked because that almost implies some intent. We take it for granted. I live in downtown Toronto, but I grew up just outside in Oakville in the suburbs. And one of the clearest memories I'd have in my head is coming home from wherever we were. It was a hockey practice, visiting my grandparents, friends of the family sort of thing. But I knew when I saw the light of the dry cleaners around the corner that I was home. Couldn't really tell where I was on the highway or anything like that. But as soon as I saw that business and that light, I knew where I was. And that is true for so many people across the country. Small businesses are markers. There are meeting spaces. They are the names on the back of our kids' hockey sweaters or baseball jerseys. They are ingrained in the community. And when you lose one, you are losing a small piece of the community's soul. And that is something worth marking. And as best we can, it is worth something worth avoiding because while there may be a business that replaces it, it may, a coffee shop may be another coffee shop. It's not the same. And that needs to matter.
What would help us avoid that? And I ask this, sure, from the government, but they've already made clear, I guess, that the deadline's the deadline and the programs are over. But just from communities, from, I guess, the Bank of Canada, who probably everybody wants to lower interest rates. But, how do we avoid this? Are the factors just too baked in at this point?
I think there are a few things that people can do. And on the government side, I mean, it's the cost of doing business. If it's reducing fees, taxes, there's $2.5 billion of carbon tax money for Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario that the government has not returned yet. Returning that would be helpful, but anything around cost, that's important. As people, though, and again, with understanding that, totally understand there's a lot of people going through some challenging times and might not be able to support with their dollars directly. But, one of the first things to go when business is struggling can be marketing dollars. And the best marketing that a small business tends to get is the word of mouth marketing from their customers. If you talk up your favorite spots, if you let your friends and family know that the dry cleaner around the corner is fantastic, that coffee shop is great, the butcher is a wonderful guy, kind of thing, that really does matter and resonate. As much as we can rally around our local spots and remind both the business owner but the community at large what they mean to the community, I think that's something that is worth doing. And I know it sounds a little, kind of airy and sort of like, well, that's nice, but does it actually help the bottom line? And I can tell you that it really does matter. And it's not just the bottom line here. There's also the mental health of business owners, the stress that they've been under, to see the community rally around, to get talked up is helpful on that side too. And again, that also needs to matter.
Ryan, thank you so much for this. And just to end it on a positive note, there's been a new burger shop and a new ice cream shop, both small businesses opening just down the street from me over the last 3 months. So there you go.
Fantastic.
And a big Shoppers Drug Mart. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Ryan Mallough, Ontario Vice President with the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. That was The Big Story. For more, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. You You can also find us if you want to give us some feedback by emailing hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or by calling 416-935-5935. If you've never left a rating or a review for The Big Story in Apple Podcasts or Spotify or anywhere else, now is a perfect time to do it. We are looking for feedback. We're looking for you to help other people find this show. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.